the most frequently asked question that our team gets around the world, or the most frequently asked theme we're asked to speak on around the world, outside of that question I just got. And it has to do with the problem of pain and suffering. In fact, it was asked immediately after I was speaking today. Someone had asked me this question. I'm a believer, but how do I talk about or even express the idea that a good God exists when there's so much of pain and suffering in the world? And it's a valid question. It's a deep question. It's a hard question. It's one we can't gloss over. But let me just say this to you. The reality is that if you were to look at professional philosophers, okay, they'll tell you, whether they're Christians or atheists or anything in between, they'll tell you the so-called logical problem of evil, as it was called, is no longer a problem. That's been dealt with, actually. Most philosophers working today, in fact, I would say the vast majority, would say there is no logical incompatibility with a God who is all good and all powerful and the existence of evil. And the reason is because when you think about it logically speaking, what you have to say is that there can be no justification. God can have no justification whatsoever for allowing evil to exist for a greater possible good. But you and I can't possibly say that there's no justification because we don't know everything that a God like that, if he existed, would know. So it can't be logically impossible. There might be morally sufficient reasons for God to allow suffering for a greater good if he's all-powerful, all-knowing, and these kinds of things. So that's sort of gone by the wayside. But what has remained is what's called the probabilistic or the emotional problem of evil. Why is there so much of it? It's one thing to allow some, but why do you allow this much? That's a different question. It's a far different question. I was sitting, I'll give the answer that I often give in the context of a conversation I had with an atheist friend of mine. Now, when we were in school together, we were close, and I was a Muslim then, and he was an atheist, and we didn't talk about matters of faith very much, which is weird for me because I talked about it with everybody, but not him. For some reason, we just didn't talk about it. So he went his way, and I went my way, and then he was coming into town for business, and he calls me up and he says, "Hey, Abdu, I'm coming to town for business. Pick the fanciest restaurant in Detroit you can find. We'll expense it, and we'll have a great time catching up." And I said, "Great, if you pay, I'll pray." And he's like, "Okay, fine." He sort of rolled his eyes over the phone. I could hear them his eyes rolling. So we got together and we had a great time. And as we sat down for dinner, we got into things, like family and career and all that stuff. And he wanted to know how I became a Christian, because the reason he found out I was a Christian was that he went to my wedding, which was only a few years before that, and he discovered something was different. He's like, "I think something happened because we're at a church." And he's praying in Jesus' name while he's saying his vows and all this stuff. So he's like, being a sharp guy, he's like, something's different. So he wanted to know how that happened. So I told him all the philosophical and all these things, reasons, and he's like, "Look, my problem is this. How can I believe in a God who is all-powerful and all-good if there's so much evil and suffering in the world? Because if he was all-powerful, he would be able to stop the suffering. If he was all-good, he would want to stop the suffering, but the suffering still exists. So either he's not all-good, or he's not all-powerful, or more likely, he's not even there." That's like dinner conversation. So we began to go into it. Now, one of the things you have to notice here is this, is that when you make the statement that there is so much evil and suffering in the world, whether it's from human interaction, there's a moral evil, like I do something terrible to someone else, someone robs someone murders someone, genocides are committed. You're talking about a moral evil. And so you're positing the existence of an objective morality. You're already saying there's got to be an objective morality, because what you're saying is, as a matter of fact, not a matter of human opinion, it is wrong to kill people without justification. That's what we're saying. And we're saying it's not based on human opinion, which is the very definition of objective. If it was subjective, it would be based on human opinion. And since we believe in objective values, although not all of us do, but when you posit this problem, you say there's so much suffering and evil, what you're saying is that there's got to be an objective moral standard. Now you can say, well, let's take the realm of human beings out of it. Let's say volcanoes. How about tsunamis? How about, plate tectonics and the movements of the tectonic plates that cause earthquakes? And people die from natural disasters. There's no moral agency involved in that at all. That seems to be a terrible evil, and suffering, so that seems wrong as well. But you see what's happened here is that all you've done is remove human agency from the problem, but you've still included human suffering. Ravi puts it this way: the problem of evil is always a personal problem because it's either asked by a person or about a person. So it's always personal. So it's always moral, whether it's plate tectonics and volcanoes or rape and murder. Always. So in every instance, when you posit the problem of evil and suffering, you are always positing the existence of an objective moral value. Evil being the privation or the perversion of the good. So you're assuming evil, therefore you assume good. The only way that good and evil as categories can actually exist on an objective level is if those things exist apart from human opinion. Because if they're based on human opinion, then they're subjective. Do we see that so far? So you get a classic example is this. In this country, it was legal to own people as property. It was legal, and the majority of people for a long time, not always, but for a long time, thought it was perfectly moral to own people. Was it? No. Even when everybody thought it was okay, it wasn't okay. Evil is still evil, even if everyone believes it. And good is still good, even if no one believes it. So these are objective truths, which means they have to transcend human existence. Now, here's the problem. Where do you find these things then? Plato talked about this. This was something that the ancient philosophers talked about all the time. Where do you find morality? Where is it? Plato called them the forms. The morality existed out there. Like he thought that good existed apart from God. Like, oh, there's goodness, and the gods are subjected to goodness. But the problem is this. Good can't be just out there. I mean, think about it. There goes goodness. Look how goodness is being. Or look how justice is being. Or look how kindness is. They don't do anything. These are abstract concepts. So an abstract concept can't do anything, which means that if goodness exists, it violates itself because it can't live up to its own standard. Rather, morality only makes sense if it's rooted in persons. See, chairs aren't good. Air isn't good. The number 7 isn't good or bad. But persons are good or bad. So follow me on this. If you need a transcendent source for morality, and transcendent morality needs to be rooted in a person, it can only be rooted in a transcendent person. Who does that sound like? That sounds like God. So the problem of evil doesn't disprove God's existence. The problem of evil actually proves God's existence. Because anytime you're talking about the things in the world that are wrong with it, you have to realize that there is a straight line by which you measure all the bent ones, to quote C.S. Lewis. That's the first level. So my friend and I were talking, because okay, I kind of get that, that's fine. But then the conversation changed. You see, he went on a different tack. And I said, well, one of the ways you can actually talk about suffering as well is that if God exists, then he must be a being, the God I'm talking about. And here's the thing too, people often start at this problem with a misconception of God. They're challenging a conception of God that Christians have never held to. That God is somehow helpless, or God knows stuff, but if he did know stuff, he wouldn't do the things he does. He's kind of like Zeus or like Artemis or whatever it is, and that just doesn't jibe with the Christian message. So I told my friend, essentially, what I believe and what the Bible teaches that God is God is the necessary being. He is the being from whom all other things find their existence. He is the source of all being. And he also is the source of all knowledge and truth. So if that kind of a God exists, you have to prove that it's logically impossible for that God to exist and suffering exist. So here's the problem, is that if the God that I believe in exists, then he's a God who knows everything. He knows all past things, he knows all present things, he knows all future things, and he knows all future possible things. What in philosophy is called a counterfactual. So, I'll give you an example of what I mean. You could have chosen not to come here. You could have decided, you know what, I want to go get dinner and a movie, and I'd rather not hear that guy again. You could have chosen that. And from that decision, a billion other things would have occurred. Billions of things would have occurred. You could have got indigestion. You could have had an argument on the way to the restaurant. You could have gotten in a car accident. You could have stopped somebody who needed help. You might have said something nice to the waitress when it would have affected her day, and her day would have been changed when she went home and talked to her husband, and they would have made up, and their marriage would have got saved. Who knows what would have happened? A billion things would have happened, and that's one decision one person makes. So God knows all the decisions and all the counterfactual decisions, the ones you could have made but didn't. So he knows all that spiderweb of future history. So isn't it possible, I ask my friend, that a God who knows all of that could have a morally sufficient reason to allow, not cause, but allow some instance of suffering to happen in our lives for a greater possible good that we have no ability with our limited finite minds to know about? It might become obvious to us in 5 minutes or 50,000 years or in the eternity to come, but isn't it at least possible? The first thing he said was no. Like, well, I spent all that time. No, that's your answer? But he said, no, the tsunami that happened in 2004. Remember that tsunami that wiped out 250,000 people and left millions homeless? He's like, how can you possibly say that? That tsunami results in a greater possible good. I said, here's the problem with your answer, is that what you're telling me is you know with 100% certainty there is no possible future where there is something better that could come about because of that tragedy. So you're claiming to have infinite knowledge of the future. And if you're claiming to have infinite knowledge of the future, you're using your infinite knowledge of the future to disprove the existence of a being who has infinite knowledge of the future. Do you see how self-defeating that actually is? And he agreed, and that's when the conversation really shifted. By this time, the waitresses stopped serving us the coffee, and we were the only ones left in the restaurant. And he looks up at me from the cold coffee with sort of a mist gathering in front of his eyes, and he says, I want to know this. How can you tell me this God values me or my mother and that he's good when he let her die when I was 10? See, the philosophical rubber meets the existential road at this particular moment, doesn't it? It's not an academic question anymore. In fact, it never was. Never was. So what do you do at that moment? Well, I prayed quick, and I asked the Lord to give me something that would be true and relevant to his pain. You see, here's the problem. He was 10 when that happened. He was 38 when he asked me. 28 years of atheism did not clear up the tears. It never gave him fulfillment, because if Dawkins is right, Richard Dawkins is right, one of the most prominent atheists in the world, he says the universe is blind, pitiless, and indifferent. There is no such thing as evil or good, no design, no purpose. All we have is meaningless tragedies and meaningless good fortune. So her death was not a tragedy, it was a meaningless tragedy. He offers him no comfort whatsoever. So you can live with that, or you can suggest the alternative. So I said this to him. I said, we've been talking for a while now, and you agreed that God could allow suffering for a greater possible good. You agreed. That's possible. He said, yeah, because he was waiting for me to use his mother as a punchline to a philosophical argument. I said, you know what? It's a nice theory. A Christian can tell you that. A Muslim can tell you that. A Buddhist can tell you that. A Hindu can tell you that. Some Hindus. They can tell you this. God works in mysterious ways. It's a nice theory. But you've experienced a terrible loss. I have no idea what it feels like to experience that loss. I've lost people, but never someone so close to me, especially at such a tender age. I can't imagine. He called it a life-shaping moment. Of course it was. So, but here's what I want to offer you. That theory is valid, but that's all it is, unless it's backed up by history. And contra to Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, any other ism and schism you can think of, contra to all those worldviews, I don't have a mere theory that gives me a mere glimpse of hope. I have actual fact to back up that God could allow suffering for a greater possible good, because God did allow suffering for the greatest possible good. He let his own son die, not for some theoretical good, but for the greatest good there could possibly be, the salvation of the entire world. He offers that to you, I said, and he offered that to your mother. Then you asked me one other question. You asked me the question about value. You said, how can I know that God values me or my mother? How do you know how valuable anything is? How do you know? It's not rocket science, really. There's these wonderful things in my house, all these, these pictures my kids draw when they were kids, and you say, oh, how beautiful. It's not really, but you say it is because it's your kid, and you put it on and it's like a bad Picasso, and you put it on your refrigerator and all this, and they write you little notes, and my wife sent me stuff, and my wedding video, and my wedding pictures, all valuable. But if there's a fire in my house, I'm getting my wife and my kids, and we're getting out. And I'm not going to save those things. They're all going to burn or melt or whatever, because I'm not going to make my wife a widow or my kids fatherless over those things. I value them, but not that much. But if my wife or my child or my kids are in that house, you better believe it. I will risk everything to save them. You know how valuable something is by what you're willing to pay for it. And a blind, pitiless, indifferent universe does not pay for you. But the immeasurable God paid an immeasurable price to spend an immeasurable eternity with your mother and with you. You can know that you have an objective, immeasurable value because of that. You see, so friends, pain is the signal of value. If you were to go to any other worldview, and they would tell you what is pain all about, a Muslim would tell you it's just a test. It's a test of your faith. When you lose a child, when you lose someone, when you are injured, it's a test to see, are you going to blame God or whatever it is? And there's a validity to that to a point. But when that's all it is, it seems awfully cruel. A Hindu would tell you it's your karma. It's the bad karma from a previous life coming to revisit upon you. But you have to realize something, friend. It's all an illusion. See, you're the divine being. A Buddhist would say the same thing, that all pain is an illusion, and you need to wake up from the illusion of the reality you're living in, because it's not really real. And then when you get rid of that illusion, you'll be free of pain and suffering. And all these things. And an atheist would say basically, tough, get over it. I don't know what to tell you. The problem is none of those things deals with the real issue, does it? Just a test, it seems cruel. If it's an illusion, if your suffering is an illusion, then the person you lost meant nothing. I mean, can you imagine losing someone and then feeling nothing about it? Then that person meant nothing. But if you feel the deep anguish of pain, that means that person actually meant something to you. Pain is the signal of value. That's why you can know you have value, because God himself, in a world where suffering exists, suffers himself for your sake. My buddy looked at me and he said, it's a lot to think about, but man, that's worth believing. So pain and suffering, I don't think, are meaningless. If there's no God, then they are. But I think that you can see that God actually does allow suffering. I can trust that God has allowed suffering in any one of our lives, because God did allow suffering in his own existence for a greater good. We can trust him in that. Why does he allow your particular suffering? I have no idea. I would be insulting you if I told you I knew why. I don't know why he allows mine. But the good news is that because of the suffering he went through, I'll have an eternity to find out. And so will you. And I really can't give you more comfort than that, other than to say there's nowhere else you can go for a better answer than that.